Hi, my friends. We're finishing up the book of Acts by looking at one last journey that Paul goes on. Paul has gone on 3 missionary journeys, and he had his sights set on going back to Jerusalem. He wanted to go back to Jerusalem, but when he got there, things did not go well. When Paul gets to Jerusalem, he immediately goes to the temple and he begins preaching. He begins talking about Jesus. Well, this incites a mob. The Jewish leaders are not okay with this, and things get so crazy that Paul's arrested. And the arresting officer's like, has this man done wrong? What are they doing? And they can't even really figure out what he has done wrong. And so the commanding officer brings Paul inside, asks him a question, and then he gives Paul a chance to speak. He takes him back out kind of to the porch and allows Paul to speak. And Paul is sharing with the people there. He's talking to them about Jesus. He's telling them his conversion experience. And as he's telling them his conversion experience, the mob gets so crazy and so riled up and so angry that the guards actually have to lift Paul to their shoulders and carry him back into the fortress because the mobs are just nuts. They're trying to kill Paul. While Paul is in the fortress, there's a plot that's devised that men are not going to eat or drink anything until Paul is killed. Well, luckily, Paul's nephew hears about this and goes and tells the commanding soldier. The commanding soldier talks to Paul, and so in the middle of the night, they give Paul a horse to ride and they send him off to Caesarea, where he then is sent to Governor Felix. Felix and his wife are really entertained by Paul, so that every few days they call him in for about 2 years to hear Paul's story. Over and over and over, Felix keeps listening to Paul, but he never makes any decisions. He never lets Paul go. So Paul's kind of under arrest, but Felix just enjoyed like having his own little private pastor that can come talk to him whenever he wants to. Well, there's a changeover in leadership, and now Festus becomes the ruler in charge of Caesarea, and so Festus is there, and so Paul is called before, and Paul appeals to Festus, and so Festus, he listens to Paul and he's not sure what to do, and then King Agrippa comes. And during this time, Festus is trying to gain popularity with the Jewish people who are in the area, and they want to send Paul back to Jerusalem to be tried there because they still want to kill him. And so Festus is open to this idea, and as Festus is entertaining the idea, Paul says, I appeal to Caesar. I want to go to Caesar. And so Festus is listening to him, King Agrippa's listening to him, everybody's listening to him. And by the time they boil it down to, they're like, yeah, we would have let him go, but he appealed to Caesar, so I guess we're going to send him to Caesar. And so Paul gets his wish. He gets to go to Rome. Paul had wanted to go to Rome for a long time. So Paul's being shipped off to Rome. But all of these things that have happened have been in answer to what God said was going to happen, that Paul would be a witness to both Gentiles and to kings. And by this time, he's talked to Felix and Festus and Agrippa, and now he's going to probably talk in front of Nero. And so there's this progression, and that Paul knows he has this call in his life. In fact, when he was in the mob situation that I was talking to earlier, where the soldiers had to carry him on their shoulders, one of the things that God says is, don't worry, don't be discouraged. You will get to go to Rome. It tells us in Acts 23:11, it says, that night the Lord appeared to Paul and said, be encouraged, Paul. Just as you've been my witness here in Jerusalem, you must preach the good news in Rome as well. And so God has let Paul know that he is going to Rome. And so that's where we're going to pick up our story in Acts chapter 27. So join me in reading Acts chapter 27, verse 1. When the time came, we set sail for Italy. Paul and several other prisoners were placed in the custody of a Roman officer named Julius, a captain of the imperial regiment. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was also with us. We left on a ship whose home port was Adramyttium on the northwest coast of the province of Asia. It was scheduled to make several stops at ports along the coast of the province. The next day we docked at Sidon, and Julius was very kind to Paul. He let him go ashore to visit some friends so they could provide for his needs. Putting out to sea from there, we encountered strong headwinds that made it difficult to keep the ship on course. So we sailed north to Cyprus, between the island and the mainland, keeping to the open sea. We passed along the coast of Sicily and Pamphylia, landing at Myra in the province of Lycia, where the commanding officer found an Egyptian ship for Alexandria that was bound for Italy, and he put us on board. So we're going to pause there for a minute. So here's Paul. He's on his way to Rome because he's appealed to Caesar. So he's a prisoner. What's interesting is Aristarchus gets to come along with Paul, and Aristarchus is from Macedonia. He's from Thessalonica. Paul might have met him when he was in Macedonia, in Philippi, there when he was thrown in jail with Silas. Maybe that's when they met, and Paul, being a Roman citizen, even though he's a Roman citizen, that didn't protect him, but this time being a Roman citizen allowed him some comforts. You see, in Rome, if you were a citizen, even if you were a prisoner, you were allowed to take with you two people. You were allowed to take a slave, and you were allowed to take a doctor, because their prison system wasn't like ours, where they would provide you with meals and other stuff. As a prisoner, you had to provide for yourself. And so if you were traveling, you needed people who could run around and get you food or to take care of you, because the guards weren't going to be taking care of you. They weren't going to be feeding you. You had to kind of figure that out yourself. And so because he was a Roman citizen, he got to take these two people with him. He got to take Aristarchus. And notice again, in this part of Acts, we start having first person language again, which means Luke, the medical doctor, is with Paul too. So we have Paul, Aristarchus, and Luke on this part of the journey. And already as they're on the ship, they've made friends with the Roman centurion enough that when they land, they're allowed to go hang out with their friends. They're allowed to go let the Christians in the town take care of them, which tells us so much about Paul. Even though he's in chains, even though he's headed off to Rome kind of against his will, or not the way he would have wanted to, because the Jews are trying to kill him, he does not let that affect his attitude or how he's living in life. He leans into a situation, and he is so kind, and he is so Paul. He's probably preaching, he's everything he is in such a way that he has influence over his guard, the guard that could lose his life if Paul runs off. The guard trusts him enough that he's able to go ashore. Well, they get back on the ship, and they're making very slow progress. The winds are blowing against them, and so they stop again. The commanding officer found the ship going to Alexandria, and so he dumps Paul and the other prisoners on board the ship heading to Alexandria, and so Paul is on his next leg of the journey. So this leg of the journey is going very slowly. There's lots of headwinds, and they're not making very good pace. So they finally land in Fair Haven, and then the discussion is, are we going to keep moving forward? Are we going to stay here for the winter? Because you do not want to be on the Mediterranean Sea in the winter. It is unnavigable. Like, the storms are crazy. There's like hurricanes that happen all the time. It's just nuts there, and it's extremely dangerous. The problem in Fair Haven is it wasn't a real good port for them to be in, and the ship they were in likely wasn't doing so well and couldn't handle the weathers in an exposed port. And so back and forth goes the conversation. Should we stay here? Should we try to get to a port like 40 miles, up the coast? Where should we go? What should we do? And so we're going to pick up in Acts 27, verse 9. It says, we had lost a lot of time, and the weather was becoming dangerous for sea travel because it was so late in the fall. And Paul spoke to the ship's officer about it. Men, he said, I believe it is trouble ahead if we go on, shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. But the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. And since Fair Haven was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, further up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Phoenix was a good harbor with only a southwest and northwest exposure. So what I love here is Paul's a prisoner on a ship being headed places. This is his second ship, but still he has enough influence that he is able to say to the ship's captains and to the Roman soldier who would have been in charge on this ship and the owner, no, I don't think this is a good idea. I think this is dangerous for us to keep moving forward. They don't listen to him, but he still has the influence to say that. And my friends, how many of us, when we're going through the hardest times and we're in the least of circumstances, because of our actions, still have influence on people who are in charge? My friends, sometimes we feel like it's only in positions of authority that we can make things happen or accomplish change or to affect outcomes. But Paul, as a prisoner, he would have been in chains. He's a prisoner on a ship. He shouldn't have had any say whatsoever. He's still able to talk to the decision makers and influence them. They decide not to go with what he says to their detriment, but he has still lived his life in such a way that he has influence. And my friend, it is so hard to do that. It is so hard when things are going wrong, or maybe I don't have a position of authority to feel like I can make a difference. Well, Paul didn't let any of that stop him. He keeps living for Jesus and living to his fullness no matter what his circumstances are. Well, we're going to pick up reading in Acts 27, verse 1. It says, "When a light wind began blowing from the south, the sailors thought that they could make it. So they pulled anchor and sailed close to the shore of Crete. But the weather changed abruptly. A wind of typhoon strength called a nor'easter burst across the island and blew us out to sea. The sailors couldn't turn the ship into the wind, so they gave up and let it run before the gale. We sailed along the sheltered side of a small island named Claudia, where with great difficulty we hoisted aboard the lifeboat, being told behind us. Then the sailors brought ropes and bound the hull of the ship to strengthen it. They were afraid of being driven across the sandbars of Syrtis off the African coast, so we lowered the sea anchor to slow the ship and were driven before the wind." Okay, my friends, day one after not listening to Paul, here's what happens. They get into the ship because there's a nice breeze. It looks favorable. But you see, when God tells us something, and when God was using Paul to warn the people, and they don't listen, we head ourselves straight into danger. And so what looks favorable on the outset is not favorable. And so they head out to sea, hoping to just go like 40 miles up the coast into, winter there. But no, that's not the case. A huge typhoon storm blows in, and it blows them out to sea. Well, they find this little island and they sail around the island, so the island takes some of the beating for just a short time. And during that time, they're able to pull the lifeboat, which would have been dragging behind their ship, up onto the ship. It probably would have taken most of the people on board to make this happen. And my friends, this is an important thing. The lifeboat would have been their last ditch, their only hope in case the ship went down. The sailors knew it would be their last ditch effort, and they needed it. They needed it to protect themselves. The people needed this lifeboat to protect themselves. And so they dragged this lifeboat up onto the ship, and then they begin throwing ropes under the hull. It's called frapping today, where they're strengthening the ship because the winds and stuff are causing the ship to spring leaks and to begin to break apart. And so they tie ropes around it to bind it together. Now, my friends, this lets us know a little bit of the state of the ship. For a ship on day one of a storm to need all of these precautions, it means the ship wasn't in that good of a condition to start with, which could have been why Paul said, "No, let's not go on this trip. It's not a good idea. I fear, danger. We're headed into the dangerous season." And so on day one, all of these things are happening and they're out in the storm. My friends, if you were Paul and if you were the other people on board, how would you feel? Paul had said, "No, we don't want to go. No, this isn't safe. It's not a good idea." But unfortunately, Paul, being a prisoner, he couldn't decide, "I'm going to sit out of this one. I'm not going there." And often in life, we find ourselves in situations not of our own making, situations that we didn't choose, unhealthy situations that we know God told us not to go in but it didn't matter. We were forced along into them anyways. Well, my friends, how do you feel in those situations? I tend to feel very frustrated and overwhelmed and God, I didn't choose to be here. Why are you letting this happen? I might be asking questions, or I could be angry with the people in charge. Why did you do this? I told you not to do it. All of the different things might be going over in my head. Let's continue in verse 18. "The next day, as the gale force winds continued to batter the ship, the crew began to throw the cargo overboard. The following day, they even took some of the ship's gear and threw it overboard. The terrible storm raged for many days, blotting out the sun and the stars until all hope was gone." Do you feel that way sometimes? I didn't choose to be here, and I can feel like all hope is gone. They have done everything they know to do, but this storm keeps raging. And sometimes we are in the storms of life, not of our own making, and they keep raging. And we do everything we know to do to help ourselves. We throw over all of the gear, we throw over cargo, we throw over the stuff that we don't absolutely need, but still the storm rages. And then on top of that, the clouds and the wind and the waves have He blocked out the sun and the moon and the stars, and they don't know where they are. They're hopelessly being tossed in the middle of the Mediterranean. They don't know if they're about to get to land or if they're going to be sunk in the middle of the sea. They're lost and hopeless. So what do you do when all hope is gone? Well, what I believe Paul does is Paul has developed a posture of prayer and connection with God. And Paul knows God's already told him he's going to Rome. So Paul knows somehow he's going to get out of this. But I believe Paul is praying and pleading for the people on the ship, for the lives, for the people who are scared. I believe Paul is pouring out his heart saying, God, please help everyone in the ship. Now, why do I believe that? Because of what happens next. As we keep reading in verse 21, it says, no one had eaten for a long time. Finally, Paul called together the crew and said, men, you should have listened to me in the first place and not left Crete. Now, Paul doesn't say this just to be nasty and to rub it in their face, but he's saying it to let them know, I had insight. So listen to what I'm saying next, because I have insight now. So he says, you should have listened to me, and you would have avoided all of this damage and loss. But take courage, none of you will lose your lives, even though the ship will go down. Now that doesn't make sense. A sinking ship, and how are we not going to lose our lives? Like, what does that mean? But you see what Paul has done, God has talked to him, and he is offering hope, and he's telling them the reality of the situation. So the answer to our prayers is not that the ship isn't going to sink. The ship is going to sink, but you're not going to drown. You're not going to die. And sometimes we need to understand that we're going to lose our job. Your health isn't going to get any better. So-and-so might die, but you're not going to lose your salvation. God is going to be with you. He's not going to let you go. And that's what Paul's saying, is the ship's going to go down because you didn't listen to me earlier, but that doesn't mean God has given up on you. That doesn't mean God doesn't still care just because we're in this storm. And sometimes a storm of our making or the storm of somebody else's making, it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. He says, the ship will go down, but you won't lose your life. And here's how I know. In verse 23, for last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me and said, don't be afraid, Paul, for you will surely stand trial before Caesar. What's more, God in his goodness has granted safety to everyone sailing with you. So take courage, for I believe God. It will be just as he said, but we will be shipwrecked on an island. My friends, do you hear what happens here? Paul says, an angel came and he talked to me. And he says, take courage, Paul, because I promised you'd get to go stand before trial before Caesar. That does not seem encouraging to me at all. Okay, Paul, you're out at sea when you didn't want to be there, but you were forced to be there. You're on this rickety old ship that's about to fall apart. And the way I'm encouraging you, Paul, is by telling you you get to go stand trial before Caesar. And tradition tells us that's not going to end well for you. It's like, that's not what I would see as encouraging. But you see, what Paul sees as encouraging is God shows up in the midst of his storm. And God says, you're going to make it out of this, and I have more work for you to do. And not only that, he says, I am going to spare your life, and I'm going to give you the lives of everyone on the ship. I believe Paul was praying for them, and so God is answering his prayer. Yes, I will save them too. Not just you that I'm going to save, I will save them all because of you and your faith. This happens multiple times throughout the Bible. Lot saves his family because of his faith. Noah saves his family because of his faith. Moses saves the whole people of Israel because of his faith. And he says, God, if you're going to count them as sins, take me off of the book of life. Take me out of the book of life too. This whole idea that one man's faith can save everybody else. And so here we have Paul, and because of his prayer, God gifts him the lives of everyone. And he says, so take courage. And then he says, believe, have faith, because I believe in the God who said this thing, and you can too. He says, but we're going to be shipwrecked on an island, so just know that. And so, the worst is not over yet. We still have to be in this together, and there's still a part they needed to play. We keep reading in verse 27. It says, about midnight on the 14th night of the storm, we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, and the sailors sensed the land was near. They dropped a weighted line and found the water was 120 feet deep. A little later, they measured again and found it to be only 90 feet deep. And at this rate, they were afraid they would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they threw out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. The sailors tried to abandon the ship. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, "You will all die unless the sailors stay aboard." So the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away. So here's what's going on. The storm is raging and it's day 14 and it's just nuts. But the sailors sense that land is near. Now, how would you sense in the midst of a storm that's raging? Well, I've read different accounts of people near this place where they end up being shipwrecked. And there are so many rocks on the beach that even from a mile out, you can hear the waves pounding on the rocks and you can see the mist and the waves as they're crashing against the shore, exploding into the sky. So amidst the storm, either they see the mist and the waves and the stuff coming up in a different way, or they hear the sound. Whatever it is, they sense that they're getting close to land. They can't tell what land, they don't know where they are. So they begin to drop lines to see how close they are, and they're moving fast into shallow ground. And this is dangerous, especially at night when they can't see anything. And so they drop the anchors, and then the soldiers are like, we have got to save ourselves. Remember at the beginning, we were talking about how they did all they could at the beginning of the story to drag up the lifeboat. The lifeboat couldn't protect everybody. There wasn't enough room. We are told that there's 270 people on this ship. There's so many people, they can't all get in the lifeboat. God has promised that they will all make it. But if we don't follow God's plan in his way, then God's promises won't come true. You see, God, when he promises stuff, there's always a part that we have to play. It's a conditional promise. If you keep following me, then I will bless you. I will protect you, but we have to let God protect us. Like, God is not going to force anything on us, even his protection, which seems weird to us, but if we don't want it, he's not going to force it on us. And so if the people had let the sailors do what they wanted to do, the sailors were just so discouraged and hopeless in this situation that they were going to make a run for it. And my friends, if they had made a run for it, I doubt they would have made it anyways, because I don't think they could have handled in a little tiny dinghy the storm that they were in. But that was their only last ditch of hope. It was their only hope. Paul knows what's going on. He knows that there's nothing that they can do in the middle of the night, that the only reason they're letting down this boat is to get in it. And he also knows that he needs the expert sailors to get the ship that they're on close enough to shore so everyone can make it. And so Paul tells the Roman soldier, and the Roman soldier by now has learned to listen to Paul. And so the Roman soldier trusts Paul enough that he cuts the last lifeline to his escape. He cuts the rope on the lifeboat, and the lifeboat falls into the ocean, and now it's no longer an option. No one can use it. It is probably quickly dashed against the stones. And you see, but what this tells us is Paul has such influence in this man's life by now that he trusts Paul over the sailors, and he knows that whatever, even if it means me letting go of my last ability to rescue myself, I'm going to trust you, Paul. And we have to get to that place in our relationships with God. Even if I'm letting go of my last ability to fix this myself, God, if you are telling me to, I have to let it go. I have to open my hands and say, God, it's yours. And I will trust you. I will do what you're asking me to do. And so the soldiers cut the ropes and the lifeboat falls into the sea. And now they're back in a place where they can be safe again. And so Paul continues. In verse 33, Acts 27, verse 33, just as day was dawning, Paul urged everyone to eat. You've been so worried that you haven't touched food for 2 weeks, he said. Please eat something now for your own good. Not a hair of your head will perish. Then he took some bread and gave thanks to God before them and broke off a piece and ate it. Then everyone was encouraged and began eating, all 276 of us who were on board. After eating, the crew lightened the ship further by throwing the cargo of wheat overboard. Do you see what happens? As the sun is beginning to come up over the horizon, Paul has gathered the 276 people on the ship, and he's like, you guys have to eat for your own good. You have to believe that not a hair in your head is going to be lost. You're going to be okay. You can trust me and trust my God. It's going to be okay. And he says, you got to eat, and no one's moving. And so Paul picks up a loaf of bread and he praises and he thanks God for it. And he breaks it and he begins to eat. And by his leading by example, everybody else begins to eat. And once everyone has been nourished enough, because what happens next, they need their strength. They need the energy that the food would have given them. They begin to throw the wheat overboard. They begin to throw anything excess overboard that they hadn't thrown over before, because they wanted to make the ship lighter so they had a better chance of getting closer to the shore, because a lighter ship rides higher on the ocean. And so they throw everything overboard. Verse 39, when the morning dawned, they didn't recognize the coastline, but they saw a bay with a beach and wondered if they could get to shore by running the ship aground. So they cut off the anchors and left them by the sea. Then they lowered the rudders and raised the foresail and headed towards the island. But they hit a shoal and ran the ship aground too soon. The bow of the ship stuck fast, while the stern was repeatedly smashed by the force of the waves and began to break apart. Do you see what happened here? Paul has said, you will not lose your life, but the ship will go down. In spite of that, they still try their best to get to shore on their own. And that's not necessarily to anybody's fault. We all should do our best to keep moving forward. But then when the ship gets stuck, they shouldn't have been surprised. But somehow in life, even though God has said, no, this isn't going to happen, or I know in my heart this isn't going to happen, or it's not what he wants, when it happens, I'm like, but God, we're so close to shore. How come we could have just gotten there and it would have been easier. But you see, there's something in the journey that God is taking us on. And so they get stuck in a shoal and the ship is getting battered by the waves and is breaking apart actively, and the ship is going down. And the soldiers want to kill everybody. As we continue reading in verse 42, the soldiers wanted to kill the prisoners to make sure they didn't swim ashore and escape. But the commanding officer wanted to spare Paul, so he didn't let them carry out their plan. Then he ordered all who could swim to jump overboard first and to make it for land. The others held on to planks of debris from the broken ship, and so everyone escaped safely to shore. Do you see this influence that Paul has on this man? He has come to trust Paul so much that he is willing to risk it all for himself. If any one of those prisoners had escaped, he would have been held liable for their sentence. But Paul has had such an influence on him, and Paul has saved them so far, and he believes that God is going to save them because of Paul's influence, that he is willing to risk his own safety, risk possible punishment for himself if any of these prisoners escape, because he couldn't say, well, kill them all except for Paul. So he says, no, don't kill anyone, because Paul had said everyone was going to make it to shore alive. And so that's what they do. Those who swam jumped overboard and they begin swimming for their life in the middle of a typhoon hurricane, which is crazy on the Mediterranean Sea. Then other people, as the ship is actively breaking beneath them, as a piece comes loose, he's like, grab that one and swim for shore. And so they all make it to shore safely. And there's a head count and no one is gone. No one is missing. So we keep reading in chapter 28. Once we were safe on shore, we learned that we were on the island of Malta. The people of the island were very kind to us. It was cold and rainy, so they built a fire on the shore to welcome us. So God hasn't just brought them to any place. He's brought them to a place where they are welcomed and they're going to be taken care of. They didn't want to stay in Fairhaven. They wanted to go up the coast a few miles. But God had other plans and other places he wanted Paul to be, and other places that he knew they would be safe. And so God sends them through a typhoon and through a hurricane to Malta. It is raining because a typhoon is still happening, and it is cold, so they begin to build a fire. And Paul, even though he's a prisoner and even though he's probably still in chains, he begins helping. It tells us, as Paul gathered an armful of sticks that were laying them on the fire, a poisonous stake driven out by the heat bit him on the hand. The people of the island saw it hanging from his hand and said to each other, a murderer, no doubt. Though he escaped the sea, justice will not permit him to live. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and was unharmed. The people waited for him to swell up or suddenly drop dead. But when they waited a long time, they saw that he wasn't harmed. They changed their minds and decided he was a god. So what's happened here? Paul has been in a shipwreck and God says, you're not going to lose your life. You're going to get to go stand trial before Rome. And so it's rainy and cold and Paul's helping to build a fire and he gets bit probably by a viper, a poisonous snake. And everyone's like, we knew, we can tell by his chains. He's a prisoner. He's probably a murderer. He deserves it. You know, karma's going to come and get him. You know, the sea's not going to let him escape. Why does God let him get bit by a snake after all of this? My friends, another bad thing happens to Paul. He's gone through so much. Why does he get bit by a snake? My friends, I believe sometimes it's in the trials of our lives, the hard things in our life, that God gives us influence over other people's lives. People first make assumptions about Paul. He must be a murderer. But as Paul shakes the snake off and is standing there, they're waiting for him to swell up and choke and to start whatever happens when you are dying of a snake bite. But nothing happens. He just continues on as normal. And they're watching him. And so for the second time in his life, they think he's a god. Now, we learned the first time they thought he was a god that Paul and Barnabas stopped the whole thing. No, we're not Zeus and Hermes. That's not the place. That's not who we are. And I know Paul would have stopped that too. But this incident lets the people on the island know, where the people from the ship already knew, that there's something special about this guy. There's something about this guy you want to know. And so Paul now has influence. People would have known about the shipwreck and the man who got bit by the viper or the snake and he didn't die. There's something about this guy you want to pay attention to. So what does God do with this? We continue reading in 28 verse 7. Near the shore where we landed was an estate belonging to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us and treated us kindly for 3 days. As it happened, Publius' father was ill with fever and dysentery. Paul went in and prayed for him and laid his hands on him. He healed him. Then all the other sick people on the island came and were healed. As a result, we were showered with honors, and when the time came to sail, people supplied us with everything we could need for the trip. It was about 3 months after the shipwreck that we set sail on another ship that had wintered on the island. My friends, do you see what happened here? Human logic said we can't winter in Fairhaven. We need to go further up the coast. That wasn't God's logic. God's logic wanted them to stay in Fairhaven, but when they decided to do something else, God sent them through a typhoon over to Malta. And in Malta, God allows Paul to have influence. This influence not only with the kings that he had earlier, but influence with the people, and he heals the people. So much so that the island then pays for 276 people to get on the next ship and gives them all of the supplies that they need to continue on their way. My friends, that is no small feat, but it is because of Paul's kindness. It is because of Paul's attitude, his character, his love for God, the way that he was always pointing back to God. Paul, Aristarchus, and Luke on this journey are this powerhouse of love and grace, pointing to Jesus, pointing to God, and how in the midst of our trials, we don't have to lean into the bad. We can lean into the good. As we continue in the book of Acts, basically what happens is they get to Jerusalem, they get to Rome, and in Rome, Paul's allowed, probably because of his influence with the Roman soldier there, he's allowed to have his own house. There's a guard there, but it's probably, you get to go hang out with Paul for the day. It's probably a privilege, but he gets to have his own house. He can see people whenever he wants. People can take care of his needs. Paul invites in the leaders of the local church who'd never heard of everything going on with Paul. He shares, they start an argument. Some believe, some don't. But Paul stays in Rome in his house for 2 years. In these 2 years, he writes the book of Romans and a number of other books. He has influence even though he can't travel, because now the guard is circulating through his house. And my friends, Paul, then he gets to speak before Nero, and it's not documented in the Bible. But we are told it doesn't end well for Paul when he goes to Caesar. But God was true in what he said. Paul gets to speak. And my friends, what we can understand is, first, we can trust God, but that doesn't mean trusting God and being obedient. It means that everything's going to go smoothly. It did not go smoothly, and Paul got carried away on a ship that he didn't want to be on. In fact, he knew he shouldn't be on, but he was carried away as a prisoner anyways. He went into circumstances he couldn't control, but his attitude and his character still mattered, and it still made an impact and a difference on everyone around him. And to the point that when he gets to Rome under guard, he's allowed to have his own house. That's unheard of. He was allowed his own place to stay. My friends, that's influence. Can the same be said of you and of me? That how we handle ourselves in the most difficult and trying of times points other people to Jesus, to the point that they trust us and they follow us and they want to be with us and they want to know Jesus. My friends, that is truly my prayer. Paul was living to the very end a life fully and completely dedicated to Jesus. My friends, are you doing the same thing? I'd really love to know. I'd love for you to take your connection card right now, and you can do that by texting the letter CC to 301-321-8848. And let me know, what did God say to you while we process through Acts chapter 27 and 28? And then secondly, how are you going to respond to God? My friends, God wants a relationship with us. He wants us to respond. What are you going to do because of what God said to you? And lastly, how can we pray for you? Because just like Paul needed Luke and Aristarchus, we need each other on this journey. So let me pray for you right now. Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that you will help us to be like Paul. Pray that you will teach us to trust you, and no matter what our circumstances are, to live in such a way that we create influence with everyone we're around, that they will trust us, that they will want to know you because of us, that, Lord, we will have the opportunity to share your love. And Lord, I pray that you help our attitudes reflect, regardless of the situation, a prayer life, one that is totally all in praying for the people around us, a life that is all about pointing more people to Jesus and not about what we can get out of it. Lord, I just pray that you teach us how to live lives like this for your glory. And Lord, I just pray for everyone within the sound of my voice. I pray that you help each one of us today to love you more, to know you more, and to share it with those around us. In your name we pray, amen. We are so glad that you came and worshiped with us this morning. You can come and process this very same passage with us today at 11:30, and you can do that either by joining us in person at our building, which is can be found at 14595 Avion Parkway in Chantilly, Virginia. Or if you're unable to meet with us in person, please join us on Zoom, where we'll have an interactive discussion as well. And you can get the links to our Zoom call by texting the word study to 301-321-8848. I realized last week that the link was broken, and so I fixed it so it will work this week. Hope to see you all soon. Have a wonderful day.